So I'd like to start with early visions of artificial intelligence and cybernetics for this talk. So this is a poem by Richard Brautigan. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's called All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace. And the final verse of the poem says, "I'd like to think it has to be of a cybernetic ecology where we are free of our labors and joined back to nature, return to our mammal brothers and sisters, and all watched over by machines of loving grace." Now, this is taken as, by some people as a satire, but by other people as a genuine celebration of one possible vision of AI, the vision of AI in which humans are free from the drudgery of manual labor, the drudgery of intellectual labor, and able to enjoy their lives, to play and have fun, while the machines do the hard work. But that is actually not necessarily the majority position of the early AI pioneers and enthusiasts. Typically, if you look at the work of people like Licklider, people like Norbert Wiener, they were of the opinion that AI will be manifested as a symbiotic technology in which humans did the things that they do well, artificial intelligence systems do the things that they do well, and together we end up with something bigger than the sum of its parts. Fitt's list, this was a list that was drawn up by Paul Fitt in 1951, where he basically put tasks or competencies into these two buckets, things that humans outperformed computers on and things that computers outperformed humans on. And so this gets to the heart of this idea of man-machine symbiosis. There are things that humans do well, there are things that machines do well, and we want to combine the two of them. And you might wonder if some of those things that Fitz put on the left-hand column, things that humans do better than computers, maybe some of those are bleeding into the right-hand column in recent years. But this is certainly one of the animating visions of AI, that humans and computers will work together. And it's one that I've been personally sort of invested in some of my work. It's something that excited me when I was getting into ideas like the Semantic Web. So this is the vision of Tim Berners-Lee and Fischetti when they were talking about their vision of Web3, not the current vision of Web3, but the old school late 90s vision of Web3, which was the Semantic Web, a web in which people can create documents that become data that can be ingested by programs on the web that allow humans to do the fun, creative stuff and computers to do the administration. And we see the same kinds of themes emerging now in industry, amongst CEOs, talking about how we need to create collaborative forms of artificial intelligence where humans and AI join forces. And one of the things that that is often advocated for in these discussions is humans need to do certain types of tasks in a system, particularly those that involve moral judgment. So the idea being that we need to maintain meaningful human control in order to have a moral conscience to the machine systems that we have. So we want humans to remain in control, especially in the eyes of some people, as superintelligence becomes a near possibility. And the idea is that humans are capable of exercising sound ethical judgment in a way that machines just aren't. So this vision of human-computer interaction and collaboration is increasingly being adopted in real decisions on an increasing basis. So medical diagnostics, doctors using AI tools to help them make decisions, content moderators not reviewing every single post on a social media site, but rather having posts flagged to them by a robot, telling them, pay attention to this one. Financial products being allocated credit, risk scoring, loans, etc. And perhaps particularly important for this project, high stakes public sector decision making. So people working in tax offices, people working in welfare offices, making decisions about people's lives, fraud investigation, child protection, parole officers. Increasingly, we're seeing AI being brought into these contexts to help frontline decision makers make decisions about people. We're moving from the idea of a street level bureaucrat. So the idea that there are laws, there are bureaucratic systems that end up getting put into practice on the ground by frontline decision makers. Those frontline decision makers are not interacting with people in the street so much anymore, but they're more likely to be interacting with people through a screen. And previous work, we've looked at how the introduction of machine learning into those spaces has changed the nature of discretion exercised by those public decision makers. And of course, we see increasingly the adoption of legislation that requires a human in the loop. So perhaps most famously, Article 22 of the GDPR. This makes it, gives people the right not to be subject to a purely automated decision that has significant effects on them. Of course, it was predated in the Data Protection Directive. It's also in Convention 108. There are similar laws in Morocco, Uzbekistan, Uganda, the state of Virginia in the US. The Platform Work Directive, which is currently under consideration, Article 8 of that gives people the right to request a human review of an automated decision that significantly affects them at work. And then if you think about public law, administrative law, decision-making can't be completely delegated to an algorithm. Certain types of decisions need to be made by human decision makers because their discretion can't be fettered. So one of the sort of underlying rationales behind these types of legal requirements is the idea that if we bring in a human in the loop, we're allowing decisions to be reconnected to the sort of emotive basis of ethical decision making. The human in the loop is there to bring a human touch. If we don't have a human in the loop, then we risk dehumanizing the people who are having decisions made about them. So the human in the loop is perhaps one possible answer to the question of how do we have humane AI as posed by the project. And this is a view that I have myself had sympathy for. I'm broadly in support of it, and much of my work has been within this paradigm. But I think we should be questioning this. For those of us drawn to this approach, I think we're potentially at risk of skirting over some quite deep contradictions. And these are contradictions between the real world dominant forces that are pushing organizations, governments, industry to adopt AI, the broader economic and political context in which they're being deployed. And I'm worried that we, and I count we, including a variety of different disciplines in academia, computer scientists, legal scholars, but also technologists and policymakers outside of the academy, I'm worried that we're spending too much time imagining AI being deployed in a relatively well-meaning, good faith, benign institution where the human in the loop is there to make sure the system doesn't deviate too far from those nice, respectable values that the institution holds. Now, I'm not denying that sometimes there are institutions like that that are deploying AI and deploying humans in the loop in good faith. But I think we should also take seriously the possibility that AI will be deployed in bad faith for darker and more worrying ends. And I think even when it's deployed in benign institutions, we should be aware that those institutions can be manipulated, corrupted, changed for the worse. And the systems that are deployed in them could be requisitioned for malign purposes. And AI systems can even play a part in that process. So what are the malign, potentially malign logics of AI that I'm referring to here? So I think for that, we can actually go back to the sort of early ideas of computation way back in the 19th century. So if we go to Charles Babbage, who was credited as one of the first computer scientists. In the original motivation for computation, he stated that humans are inherently flawed And the advantage of machinery is the check which it affords against the inattention, idleness, and dishonesty of human agents. Calculating engines precisely embodied the intelligence of theory and abrogated the individual intelligence of the worker. This is Simon Schaefer's account of Babbage's motivation for developing computation. And we see the same arguments today. We see that people refer to AI as preferential because it's neutral, it's value-free, it's objective, it has mathematical rigor and empirical data that provide unarguable justification for decision-making. We can remove bias if we use machines rather than people. Another lesson that we can draw from Babbage is that computation has long been intertwined with the interests of capital and capitalists against the workers. So again, drawing from Simon Schaffer, in his project to build intelligent calculating engines, Babbage attempted to represent himself as the intellectual manager of the complex labor relations of the machine tool industry. The idea here is that humans are workers, they have skill, they have power when they organize themselves together. They have the potential to decide how they want to organize production and what to produce for themselves. And this is a threat to capitalists, and Babbage understood this very well. His vision of computation was one which was against the organization of labor and in favor of the atomization of workers to prevent them from trying to organize things in their own way. So Babbage's principle is all about separating the sub-processes in a larger process, reducing wage costs by splitting work into different smaller chunks. And this was the same approach that he deployed to computation. These two things were part and parcel. Again, we see the same logics at work today with AI. We see that gig work especially, it serves to spatially separate workers, so it becomes harder for them to talk to each other, to organize, to unionize. It more effectively turns workers into components in a system, into cogs in a machine. So things like Amazon Mechanical Turk, Uber, Deliveroo, and other forms of gig work platforms. And then finally, I would argue that one of the things that AI aims to eliminate is the possibility of empathy between human beings. So typically, this isn't something that proponents of AI will say outright. But if you read between the lines, you can often see it. These are just a few examples of where the fact that robots and AI systems don't have emotions is seen as a positive thing. Now you can see that the spin here is that AI doesn't have feelings, so they won't be clouded by judgment, clouded by emotion. But occasionally we see what that actually means in practice. So this was a super interesting article, came out a couple of weeks ago, looking at the use of an algorithm for setting rent prices. So one of the reasons why this algorithm was, this company that provided this algorithm was particularly successful is, according to one of the developers, the leasing agents who were previously setting prices, negotiating prices with tenants, had too much empathy for those tenants, often because they came from a similar social background as them. They saw that prices were going up too high, and they felt sorry for the people who were trying to find a place to live. So the problem was that there was too much empathy in this system. Using an algorithm actually removes that empathy. That's another example of the underlying logic of AI. Actually, it's a feature that it removes empathy from the system. So if these potential underlying rationales for AI are true, then it seems to me that a major motivation for AI has been the restriction of humans as a source of judgment, as a source of intellectual labor, the rejection of humans as workers with common material interests and a stake in the organization of how things get produced. the elimination of humans as a source of emotion in decision-making processes. So if all these things are true, then what is the point of a human in the loop? The very point of AI is to bring human judgment out of the loop. And then the human in the loop is there to somehow bring it back in, right? So there seems to be a contradiction here, or at least these two things seem to be pulling in opposite directions. So the question is, which of these two approaches is going to win? If we really believe that the human in the loop is there to bring a human touch back in, is it really strong enough to act as a force that fights back against those underlying logics? Or is it just a sort of false reassurance that we have these systems? Yes, there might be underlying logics that aim to bring humans out of the loop, but we can successfully put humans back in the loop and get the best of them. I'm not so sure. And that's why I think in practice, very often, what we'll have is a human in the loop becomes a human in the loophole. So the title of my talk, human in the loophole. So rather than a meaningful counteracting force, the human in the loop is a fig leaf that serves to legitimate whatever the underlying logics of the systems are. So if the purpose of AI is to bring humans out of the loop, to dehumanize, then we should be skeptical about the idea that the human in the loop is actually being offered in good faith. So what might seem like a good legal requirement, one which I have generally advocated for, might actually be a loophole that allows fundamentally anti-human technologies to be deployed. I should just credit this title. So this is stolen from Dr. Alison Gardner from Keele University. Just wanted to make sure plugged her there. It stuck it with me in my head ever since I heard her say it at a talk several years ago. So if this is the case, if the human in the loop is a human in the loophole, we should be much more suspicious about the debates that we have in academic circles and out in the real world. If we're not careful, we're going to end up with a loophole that allows systems whose underlying logic is clearly harmful and dehumanizing to be deployed. So I think it's worth seriously considering some of the long-term damage that this could do. So this is the contrast that we're typically faced with. So on the left-hand side, we have a fully automated system. A new case comes in, a loan application, a job application, and it gets placed into one of two buckets automatically, or one or more buckets. That's fully automated. And on the left-hand side, we have decision support system, which is compliant with Article 22 because there's a human who takes the label or category that's been applied to the case and decides whether that individual should be given outcome 1 or outcome 2. So this is the typical contrast that we're presented with. And what I'm worried about is that this second example can very easily collapse into the first in some subtle and complex ways. Some of the simple examples would be cases where human judgment atrophies over time. So the human is repeatedly exposed to accurate or seemingly accurate AI recommendations, and this leads to automation-induced complacency. So by the time that a case is brought before the human where they actually have to intervene and take a different decision to the algorithm, they may have lost their ability to judge or take control of the situation. So a very good example of this is people who have a Tesla. They put it into the autopilot mode. Now, Tesla say you should remain with your hands on the wheel, paying attention to the road in case you need to take over. But that is actually a lot harder to do than just driving normally. The amount of attention, the vigilance that you have to be ready to take the wheel, to understand the autopilot is no longer on, and to act accordingly, is probably actually harder than just driving normally. The other problem, which is talked about a lot in the context of Article 22 of the GDPR, is that human decision makers may end up relying too much on an algorithm and just having their approval of the system being a kind of perfunctory gesture, a rubber stamping process. Of course, there's under-reliance as well, which is where the human doesn't pay any attention to the algorithm. That's not my concern here. My concern is with over-reliance on computer outputs. So that's one of the examples talked about in the European Data Protection Board guidance on Article 22. Another possibility is that the human just simply can't keep pace with the algorithm. So if we take this idea that we can split tasks into quantitative tasks for the computer and qualitative tasks for the human, but there's a constant stream of decisions coming in. It can be very difficult for the human to keep pace. This quote from Mike Cooley, who was a trade union activist and early user of computer-aided design software, spoke about this tension where the pace, the rate at which the computer can handle quantitative data, the human being who's meant to be adding the qualitative dimension can't keep up. And so it places enormous stress on the human. But in addition to these forms of functory rubber stamping, of inattention, of being unable to keep pace, there are also cases where human judgment, human input is meaningful, but only in a subset, in a selection of cases. And that selection might be unfair and discriminatory. So this is an example from a paper by Alexander Albright, where they looked at the Kentucky pretrial risk assessment tool. This is a tool used by judges in Kentucky to decide whether people will be released without bail or not. And if you look at the decisions in the aggregate, you can see that the judges do factor in the algorithm to some extent, and they do use their own judgment to some extent. But if you distinguish between different defendants based on race, what you can find is that judges deferred to the algorithm more to the detriment of black defendants than white defendants. So we have these potential for uneven application of discretion from the human, from the human in the loop. Another slightly more complicated setup is decision triaging. So a new case comes in, the algorithm processes it, and depending on the label or the prediction that the algorithm gives, that new case might be automatically given a certain outcome. So it might be automatically that you apply for a loan. If you're low risk, you get automatically approved. If you fall below a certain threshold, or you are seen as a higher risk, then you might get deferred to a human being who makes a judgment. And that human being might still grant you your application, but they might also deny it. So these kinds of systems are very common in the banking industry, so anomaly detection systems, anti-money laundering systems, airline security screening, where the majority of people are processed automatically and some people are deferred to a human who has to assess and investigate the case. Now, one of the things that can go wrong here, similar to the previous case with the Kentucky judges, is that we end up with uneven levels of scrutiny being applied to different people. So this is an example from the UK, from the border, from the visa processing system. So there was an algorithm that was in use by border agents, by visa processing caseworkers, which looked at visa applications and automatically assigned them to a category of high or low risk. What they found was that there were these three categories of green, amber, red, and you can see here that those in the green category were much less likely to be denied a visa, and those in the red category are much more likely to be, so green much less likely, red much more likely. Now, in the report that was done into these systems, it was found that basically if you were an applicant for a visa that was automatically flagged as green, the amount of human scrutiny that you would face was effectively zero. It was pretty much a rubber stamp. But if you were red, you would be heavily scrutinized and investigated. Corey Kreider from Foxglove, which is a sort of digital rights NGO that brings strategic litigation, very cleverly coined this as speedy boarding for white people, because as you can imagine, the distribution of green, amber, and red was highly correlated with the nationality that the country that you're applying from. Another problem with decision triaging is the bootstrap problem. So this is where the idea is that we want to triage decisions because there are limited human resources to apply to different cases. We want to put the hardest, riskiest, most important cases before humans and allow machines to take care of the easy cases. But what if determining which cases require more or less human judgment is itself a task that requires human judgment? We have a bootstrapping problem. So you might be automatically categorized by a machine as not being worth consideration by a human. But that decision itself might be something that we would want a human to make. Then there's decision allocation. This is where we use algorithms to allocate cases to different decision makers, maybe in different departments, and potentially also decision makers who have a different set of potential outcomes that they can apply to a case. So maybe in a large organization, all of the employees are ranked from top to bottom. The bottom 5% get scrutinized by their managers for potential firing. The top 5% get scrutinized for potential promotion. Depending on where you fall in that automatic scale, there are certain things that could happen to you that would be impossible to happen to you if you're at the other end of the scale. So it's no sort of comfort to those who are automatically classified as in the bottom 10%, that it's a human that makes that final decision. They were already put at risk of that negative decision by the algorithm. So this doesn't remove the algorithmic nature of the decision to put you in a position where a negative or positive decision might be made about. A good example of this, again, from the UK, the ALevel algorithm. So the UK decided during COVID, because we couldn't have in-person examinations, they created a model which projected the A-level, so the sort of high school examinations for different schools based on their previous attainment. So if you went to a school that previously only 5% of people got an A, then your school would be predicted to only get 5% A's, and you as an individual student, no matter how good you were, if you were in the top 6%, it would be impossible for you to get an A. You have to be in the top 5% to have a chance of getting an A. But they argued that this wasn't an algorithm, a fully automated decision, because the teachers made the decision about your rank within the school. So your teacher would decide whether you're at the top of the class or the bottom of the class. So they argued that that meant that it wasn't a fully automated decision. But what that leaves out is the fact that the number of A's and B's and C's available to each school was algorithmically determined. So the teacher has the final decision over what small ration of grades are available. Again, hiding upstream automation with a human that's at the very end of the loop, that doesn't have the power to actually increase the number of A's that are available for any given school. So another reason that we argue we should have human in the loop is that it provides a locus of responsibility. There's someone there who can face consequences for bad decisions. So the idea that we can blame the computer goes away because there's a human being there making a decision. Unfortunately, in practice, many of these systems involve many different humans making lots of small decisions that result in negative outcomes. This is Therac 25, was a medical algorithm that ended up with many people being misdiagnosed and actually facing quite bad medical outcomes as a result of this algorithm. There was no particular person to blame. There were lots of different people who made decisions. So this is the problem of many hands. So if we try to develop human in the loop so that we have someone to blame for an individual decision, doesn't mean that that person was actually to blame for that decision. We might end up in a situation where we hold people liable even though they're not in control. People are put forward as what Madeline Eilish calls moral crumple zones. So the front of the car that's designed to collapse when you impact, that's the role that the human is playing. They're there to be someone to blame for when something goes wrong. Procedural justice. So this is the idea that people should be able to understand how a decision is made about them, to put forward their view, and to be able to see that the decision, even if they disagree with the outcome, the decision was made in a fair way. So that's one of the reasons we might have human in the loop, to ensure procedural justice. And I previously did some research on this, looking at whether people had perceptions of procedural justice were affected by the use of algorithms and the use of explainable algorithms. And procedural justice typically involves the decision subject being able to put forward their view to the decision maker so that can be factored into their decision. But AI typically doesn't allow for that form of input. And it's also hard for human beings to argue with statistical justifications that you get from AI systems. And also procedural justice is ultimately about how people feel, not actually how the decision was made. This brings me on to explanations. So if you look at the stated motivation for adopting explanations in the explainable AI literature, or let's say not literature in an academic sense, but industry white papers and business press, you see over and over again the same argument, which is that we need explainable AI to increase trust in AI, in humans. Now, there's a number of problems with this argument. The first of which is trust can be well-placed or misplaced. So we only want to increase trust in examples of trustworthy decisions. So the danger here is that if we use explanations to increase the trust that a human in the loop has in the system, then if the prediction that the system is giving them is wrong, we've increased trust in a wrong prediction. A better goal would be trust calibration or warranted trust. That would be a better goal for explainable AI. But sadly, this isn't the goal that you typically see argued for here in the sort of explainable AI industry literature. Ironically, if we want the public to trust AI, according to this paper by Ferrario and Loy from this year, actually what we should want is for the public to know that the decision makers who are relying on AI don't trust it. That would make AI more trustworthy. But that's typically not the goals that are stated for explainable AI. This brings me to a question, the discussion we were having earlier about the fact that humans in the loop in sort of non-algorithmic settings typically have to make decisions which affect distributive justice in various ways. So the example I raised in my question to Marie was teachers who have to do various things to help disadvantaged pupils be able to participate fully in school. Now, one of the motivations for algorithmic fairness is that if we make algorithms fair, we can increase distributive justice. So an optimistic view might be that if we include humans in the loop, then we can make sure that humans make individually fair decisions, and algorithmic fairness is there to ensure that overall distributions made by the algorithm in a statistical sense are fair. But there's a tension here potentially between frontline workers, their own interpretations of justice, and the redistributive justice goals that are at a local scale that those individuals are making, versus the group level fairness constraints that are imposed in the sort of AI fairness literature. So there's going to be tensions between those frontline workers' own interpretations of distributive justice and the sort of algorithmically imposed statistical constraints. And then one final kind of reason to be skeptical about the human in the loop discourse is that what you see now is that many companies, some that offer AI as a service, others which specialize particularly in providing humans in the loop as a service. So these are companies like, so an example of the first one would be Amazon Augmented Intelligence. So as well as using Amazon's ML products as a service in your organization, if for legal reasons or other reasons you want to include a human in the loop within that package, you can use Amazon Mechanical Turk fully integrated into that service. And there are other companies that offer human in the loop as a service separate to the AI as a service. And the idea is that this is actually, rather than just putting humans in the loop that have previously been caseworkers in that particular domain, providing them with an algorithmic suggestion, instead of doing that, actually maybe there's a separate class of specialized humans in the loop that can be provided as a service who have good quality intellectual labor that they can perform, that they're skilled at. That's the optimistic view that's presented by these companies. The reality, unfortunately, is more like this. Predatory attempts to make low-paid, low-quality work, particularly in the global south, where the human in the loop is actually a highly exploited click worker who has bad conditions, who's forced to look at very disturbing content as a content moderator. That's probably more likely the reality of the human in the loop, rather than a kind of new class of professional, skilled, well-paid and fair work that emerges to meet that demand. Okay, so that's a pretty negative set of considerations about the human in the loop. So what if all of those things are true? If my negative picture of the human in the loop is true, isn't there still something to be said for it? The idea that if we have a human in the loop, there always is a chance that a bad decision gets prevented. So this is put very well by Dan McQuillen in his recent book, Resisting AI. He says that, much as I've been arguing, the algorithm is understood to be the manifestation of organizational priorities. In effect, the human in the loop will be overridden by the institution in the loop. So that's been my concern here. However, he says, with a human in the loop, the smooth functioning of institutional processes that are discriminatory, unethical, or unjust are always vulnerable to interruptions from acts of individual conscience or reflective or collective refusal. So maybe, even if all those things I've said are true, having a human there to actually throw their body on the gears of the system and say, no, I don't think this decision should be made, no matter whether the algorithm is highly accurate, whether I have very little autonomy in my job, authority, I'm still going to say no. So what precedents, what sort of historical examples might we look to see how this kind of human in the loop as a last resort might work in practice? So I think one example we could go to would be examples that maybe predate digital software algorithms as such. And we look at cases where decision-making was still algorithmic in a sense, even though it was before modern computing. So we think about states, companies, they've long used algorithmic forms of information processing to manage citizens, to manage workers. So think about the automated census gathering, the punch clock in which workers go in and out of work. Human discretion has often been involved in these systems. So there is still individual acts of classification, individual acts of leniency when the system sometimes is overridden. But typically human discretion has been curtailed by these systems. This is an example of the Hollerith tabulator that was used in the US Census. Here's an example of an IBM tabulator that was popular in the sort of 1930s. Obviously, these systems were being developed for a range of different use cases, typically census gathering, large information processing needs of large corporations. But sadly, despite benign intentions initially, these systems were adopted during the Second World War by the Nazi regime to process people, to identify the victims, to identify Jews and others, to index them, to find where they lived, to hunt them down, and to send them to concentration camps. So I'm going into a dark place here, but I think it's worth thinking about these historical precedents and thinking about, given that there are algorithmic processes going on, and given that there are humans ultimately that have the power to override these processes, what can we learn about humans in the loop of these types of systems? So an example, perhaps a famous example of this is Adolf Eichmann. So Eichmann was sort of one of the chief architects of the Holocaust. And so here's someone who was in the loop of a big bureaucratic algorithmic system. Clearly not someone who stood up and said, actually, no, we shouldn't be doing this. Someone who went along with the processes, the infrastructure that had been built for this purpose. And there are kind of two different accounts of what kind of man Eichmann was. So on the one hand, there's the Eichmann that Hannah Arendt profiled. So she argued that Eichmann was actually not a sort of passionately evil person. He was someone who was very dedicated to rule following. He was very sort of detail oriented, was obsessed with following orders and going along with the flow of things, but he wasn't a passionately evil adherent to the Nazi ideology. The other picture that emerges of Eichmann, if you look further back in his history, this was someone who was actually very passionately anti-Semitic and was very committed to the work that he was doing. So there's this two versions of Eichmann, one the sort of thinking evil and the other one the unthinking evil. But either way, the system that he was part of was one which made it possible for him to make those decisions, to go along with that, with those processes. We may never know which of those two versions was the real Eichmann, but genocide and cruelty and exploitation are all dependent on broader systems that allow the human decision makers to go along with the orders that they're given. The systems are set up to facilitate both kinds of evil, the banal kind and the passionate kind. So what about counterexamples to that? So at the time that this was going on, there were also another set of algorithmic processes, the Algorithmic Visa processing that closely mirrors the visa processing example I gave earlier, where there are bureaucrats sitting in offices deciding whether to grant visas. Visas were necessary for millions of victims of the Nazi regime who were trying to flee. They faced a hostile global border regime in which many countries would not let them in unless they had an exit visa to get out. And many of these countries had rules that meant that the consulates would not be able to grant those visas. So this presented a dilemma to those who were working, who were aware of the threat of Nazism, but were equally aware of their national laws that prevented them from granting those visas. But some brave individuals did choose to override those orders, saving thousands of lives. So one of those is Shun Sugihara, a Japanese diplomat who saved thousands of lives by granting visas that he technically wasn't supposed to grant. Another example, Portuguese consulate in Bordeaux, Aristides de Sousa Mendes. Another example close to home, in addition to the people working in the visa offices, there were also people working in the resistance here in Amsterdam to help stop the advance of the Nazi regime into the records of the Amsterdam Civil Registry Office. So this was where there was a centralized record of who all the Jews in Amsterdam were and where to find them. Now, there were a set of brave resistance fighters who went in and destroyed these records, potentially saving, again, thousands of lives. So these are examples where the human in the loop can choose to disobey orders, can choose to go against the system. But for every Sugihara, de Sousa Mendes, the Dutch resistance, there are going to be little Eichmanns. But those little Eichmanns, they don't come from nowhere. They come from the concerted efforts of powerful interests to create institutional and technical infrastructures which allow those types of people to flourish, whether it's the passionate fascists like the early Eichmann or the unthinking bureaucrat like Arendt's Eichmann. So if we can identify those powerful actors, if we can map out the infrastructures that enable them, we might be able to resist them better. We should also recognize that humans in the loop are workers. They're increasingly becoming organized. They're building their own institutions and forms of power through trade unions, through alternative platforms like Turkopticon, which allows mechanical Turk workers to organize, data institutions for gig workers, legal actions being brought by content moderators against platforms like Facebook, and so on. So I think there are hopeful narratives that we can draw on to see the positive potential of humans in the loop. But I think we need to be skeptical about some of the narratives around the idea of a human in the loop. Now, I want to just end with this quote from Reuben. Oppressive structures are perpetuated by the ongoing behaviors of all participants, albeit in different ways. They're enacted and reenacted, and they cannot be transformed by the act of one individual or collective agent, no matter how powerful. So that one individual, the human in the loop in our case, can't act alone. But only by combining forces of different actors can we have a chance to stop those oppressive structures. So I'll end there. Hopefully that leaves plenty of time for questions.